Now, as the name of the video implies, this is the second part of a story, so if you haven't seen the first part yet, I'd highly recommend checking it out first, or this likely won't make any sense to you. I'll include a link to it in the description below. And now, without further ado, let's get back to the story. We start by getting a shot of the planet Coruscant, before we're taken to a large landing pad hovering amongst the clouds where several Senate guards, dressed in blue garb, and looking much like they did during the time of the prequels, stand watch over 3 individuals. 2 of them, despite now being roughly 30 years older than the last time we saw them in part 1 of the story, we instantly recognize as Leia and Han, looking much like they do in The Force Awakens. The third takes us an extra moment to recognize, mostly because of the way he's dressed, in the eloquent attire of a senator perhaps. But we quickly do realize it to be Ben Solo, perhaps around the age of 30, as he stands near his parents, an almost anxious look upon his face. We then watch as Han, who stands next to Leia, leans closer to her and says, just above a whisper, "You're nervous." He then glances over his shoulder at Ben, who doesn't even notice and says, "No, not as nervous as him." Leia gives a small grin, also glances at Ben and replies, "Of course he's nervous. He's only met Luke once, and that was when he was just a boy and obsessed with this idea that he was meant to be a Jedi." Han frowns to that and says, "Well, I wish he would have been obsessed with the idea he was meant to be a pilot." Leia gives a slight roll of the eyes and says, "Don't be bitter because he followed in my footsteps and not yours. Corellia is lucky to have him as a senator." Han gives a slight shrug to that and mutters something about how he still would have made a better pilot. He then says to Leia, "So, why are you so nervous anyway?" Leia says back, "And just how many reasons would you like me to give you?" Han again gives a little shrug, looks away from her and says, "Just as long as one of them has nothing to do with regretting picking him over me." Leia then sighs and says, "How many times have we been over this? It was never like that between us. Luke always felt more like a brother to me. In fact, I almost thought once that..." Leia falls silent and Han then says, "What, that Luke actually might be your brother?" Leia then says, her face growing distant, "We were connected in a way once, Luke and I. I know you don't like to hear about it, but we truly were. When he called out to me after we lost you on Cloud City, I felt something I'd never felt before. This strange connection to, well, everything it seemed. I thought that meant something about me, but now I realize it was just about him and his connection to the Force, and channeling it through me somehow so that we could go back and find him, well, dangling below Cloud City." Leia falls silent for a moment and then says, "And when Ben was young and showed signs that he might have the Force, I started to wonder again what that might mean about me and Luke." Once more, Leia glances over her shoulder at her son and then says, "But he hasn't shown any signs since Luke took a look at him all those years ago and told us he didn't have a particularly strong connection to the Force." Han then quickly says, "Didn't stop him from still wishing for it, and I'm not sure that's changed after all these years." Speaking of all these years, Leia begins, "I can't believe how long it's been since we last saw him." Han nods in agreement and says, "Haven't seen him since you know what happened." An expression of sadness passes by Leia's face before she shuts her eyes and nods her head, and it's just then that a small, nondescript-looking shuttle begins to land on the pad before them, and all 3 of them look excited, though none more so than Ben, who can hardly seem to contain it. Once the ship lands, the ramp lowers and 2 figures in Jedi robes walk down it. One is none other than Luke Skywalker, while the other is a tall, thin humanoid that we can't get a good look at because his hood is up and hangs low over his face. When they reach the base of the ramp, Luke says something to his companion, who then bows slightly and remains at the base of the ramp as Luke walks forward towards Han and Leia. And the look on Luke's face is mostly a calm and reserved one, though as he gets closer to his old friends, he can't seem to help himself but smile just a bit. "Han, Leia," he then says, looking at each in turn and giving them an ever so slight nod of the head as he does. "You're looking old, kid," Han then says, and to that, Luke laughs, and whatever tension was in the air seems to vanish, at least for a moment. Leia then says, "Thank you for coming, Luke. I hope you'll be happy to know we've made arrangements for you and your companion to stay with us for as long as you'd like." Leia then turns and motions for Luke to follow her, but Luke gives a regretful look and then says, "That won't be necessary. I'm afraid we won't be staying that long. In fact, I can only stay just long enough to hear this urgent matter you said you needed to discuss with me in person." Leia looks completely caught off guard to hear that and says back, "There were actually several matters I was hoping to be able to discuss with you. Not to mention, it's been so long that I thought." Luke again gives a regretful smile. "I wish I could stay, Leia. It has been too long, but there is much I must tend to." "Such as?" Leia says back bluntly. "Such as Jedi business," Luke replies. Leia gives a bit of a frown and then says, "Well, that is one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, in person, because I know it's a sensitive topic." Leia pauses, seems unsure how to say what she wants to, and then finally goes on. "The Senate has concerns about your new Jedi Order." Luke, unfazed to hear that, then simply says, "Concerns?" Leia, almost looking a bit embarrassed now, then says, "Despite learning the full truth about Palpatine, there are still those who don't see him as being the only one to blame for what happened." Luke averts his gaze a bit and nods before saying, "Palpatine was the one who orchestrated the start of the Clone Wars, and then dictated both sides of the fight. Nevertheless, some blame does fall upon the Jedi for failing to realize it before it was much too late." Leia, looking apologetic, then says, "Some feel the Jedi deserve more of the blame than that, and also feel they belong back under the oversight of the Republic." To that, Luke quickly shakes his head and says, "No, the Jedi will never again directly serve the Republic. The will of the Force is the only will we will heed." Leia nods as if she understands, but then says, "And what exactly is that will, Luke? The Republic is trying to bring order to the Outer Rim, something even the previous Republic failed to do. But in the absence of Jabba, Gregor the Hutt has become a very great threat. Surely you and the rest of the Jedi haven't failed to notice this, and could maybe even aid us in this fight. Such an act would go a long way in relieving some of the Senate's fears about what exactly you and the Jedi are up to." Luke then says, "What we Jedi are up to is keeping the galaxy safe from threats far greater than just Gregor the Hutt." Leia frowns at that and says, "The Jedi of old helped any and all who needed it." Luke quickly replies, "And the Jedi of old are no more, because they failed to see the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known. I assure you, the Jedi will never fail so utterly again." There is then a long moment of silence between them, and then Luke says, his expression softening, "I am sorry, Leia. Things are complicated for me and the new Jedi Order. And you don't think they're complicated for me and the New Republic? We could help each other, Luke." To that, Luke nods and then says, "Yes, we can. You can help by keeping the Republic strong and ready." Leia shakes her head to that and says, "Ready for what, Luke? Tell me." Luke again averts his gaze and simply says, "Vader." Leia looks troubled to hear that and says, "You can't believe he's still alive, not after all this time." To that, Luke simply says, "He does still live." Leia quickly asks, "How do you know? Can you sense him?" To that, Luke shakes his head and says, "No, I don't sense him, but somehow I still just know." Leia replies, "If he is still alive, what's he waiting for? Why hasn't he come back? Half the Empire fled into the unknown regions after Endor. If it was Vader that led them there, why did he never return with a vengeance?" Luke says nothing to that, and finally Leia says, "You're hiding something from me, I know it." Luke still says nothing, and after another long moment of silence, Leia says, "It was good to see you again, Luke," and without another word, turns and starts to walk away from him. Han looks back and forth between Leia and Luke a couple times, and finally follows her as she walks away. Luke then hangs his head, and just as he's about to head back to his ship, we hear a voice say, "Excuse me, Master Skywalker." "Ben," Luke says with a small smile upon his face, as he watches the young man hesitantly and almost awkwardly approach him. "Or perhaps I should call you Senator Solo," Luke begins, which are certainly two words I never thought I would say together. Ben smiles at that and nods. "Yes, my father is still unsure about my career path. And to be honest, so am I." Luke then sighs softly and says, "I'm sorry, Ben. As I told you and your parents all those years ago when you were just a boy, the Force is not that strong with you, not strong enough to ever hope to be a Jedi." Ben frowns, looks like he wants to say something to that, to argue against it, but finally just hangs his head, nods a bit, and the scene ends. We then get a shot of what appears to be a large asteroid, or perhaps a small wayward moon, floating and tumbling through space. and as we get closer to it, we see that there is some type of small structure attached to it, perhaps a dwelling or home of some sort for a small number of people, or even just one. Just then, a small black wedge-shaped ship with red markings flies by us and towards the small moon. A few moments later, we're inside the structure, which is for the most part rather dark, cramped, and full of strange odds and ends that appear to be antiques or artifacts from all sorts of different worlds. We then see a figure wearing a black robe and wearing some type of dark, glossy metallic mask with red accents that almost gives the impression of some type of demonic face, walking through the cramped structure and seemingly looking all about them at the artifacts as if perhaps in search of something. Just then they completely stop and slowly turn around, and we see standing behind this dark figure is an older woman holding a blaster. The dark figure then says in a female voice, "You must be the legendary Dr. Aphra." To that, the older woman raises the blaster and points it at the figure and says, with a bit of a smug grin, "And let me now guess who you are, Vader's new pet, sent to find me and take from me something I don't even have." "Is that so?" the dark figure says, as they take a few slow, cautious steps towards Aphra. "A promise was made to our great lord many, many years ago. In exchange for your life, you assured him you could find and obtain the holocron of Darth Plagueis the Wise." The dark figure takes a few more steps towards Aphra and then continues, "Now I have recently learned that many years ago, you did indeed break into a vault that had once belonged to the late Emperor Palpatine and took something from it." Aphra gives a bit of a shrug and says, "Yeah, well, it wasn't a holocron or anything else Vader would be interested in. So instead of going back to him and telling him that I'd failed and letting him kill me, I did the next best thing and started a new life elsewhere." The dark figure glances around and then says, "And what a wonderful life you seem to have built for yourself, floating on a rock in the middle of wild space." Again, Aphra shrugs and says, "It's better than being dead, I think." The dark figure takes another step towards Aphra and says, "Well, if it wasn't the holocron, tell me what you did take from Palpatine's vault." Aphra pretends to give some thought before saying, "Hard to remember, it was so long ago now. Whatever it was, I think I sold it for just a few credits. Turns out, it really wasn't worth anything." But suddenly, Aphra stops talking, and we see that the dark figure, who is now standing but a few paces from her, has her hand up, palm out, and extended out towards Aphra, who now has a totally blank look upon her face and has let her hand holding the blaster fall to her side. The dark figure then says, "Did you ever locate the holocron of Darth Plagueis?" In a monotone voice, Aphra simply says no. The dark figure then asks, "Did you ever learn its true whereabouts?" Again, Aphra says no. Finally, the dark figure asks, "What exactly did you take from Palpatine's vault?" As soon as the dark figure finishes asking that, Aphra, like a programmed droid, turns and silently walks to a different part of her little dwelling, and the dark figure follows. She then takes from a shelf what appears to be some type of ancient clay vase and simply lets it drop to the floor and shatter. Aphra then bends over and picks up a small, dark stone that had apparently been inside the vase and hands it towards the dark figure, who looks at it and says, "What is this supposed to be?" "What I took from the vault," Aphra says back, her face still blank. That's when the dark figure asks, "Why would you take a stone of all things?" Aphra replies, "He told me to hide it for him, that he might come back for it someday." "Who did?" the dark figure asks. "The Jedi who helped me break into the vault," Aphra replies. "What Jedi? What was his name?" But Aphra only shrugs and says she never learned what it was. The dark figure then reaches out her hand to take the rock, but as soon as she touches it, there is a blinding flash of light, and she quickly draws her hand back and lets out a groan of pain. The dark figure looks around for a moment, locates an old antique box on a nearby shelf, and using the Force, reaches out and takes hold of the rock and places it in the old box. She then waves her hand slightly, and Aphra seems to break free of the trance, and the first thing she does is then ask, "So, now's when you're going to kill me, I'm guessing?" But the dark figure shakes her head and says, "No, trapped in the middle of nowhere, afraid to explore, seems like a crueler fate than death for one such as you." And with that said, the scene then ends. We then get a shot of what appears to be an old Imperial Super Star Destroyer, before we see the same black wedge-shaped craft from before head towards it. Moments later, we're inside the Star Destroyer, and following the dark figure as she marches down a corridor and towards a set of double doors, being guarded by red-clad Imperial guards. She says nothing to the guards, and they say nothing to her, and after a few seconds, the double doors slide open, revealing an almost pitch-black room beyond. The dark figure walks forward a few steps, and then drops to a knee just as the doors behind her now begin to slide shut. When they're completely closed, and we can only make out the vague outline of her within the darkness, we hear the somewhat mechanical voice of Darth Vader say to her, "You return to me, my apprentice, and yet you do not have what I seek." The figure replies, "I located Dr. Aphra, my master, but she did not have the holocron, and had never had it." Vader replies, "And yet I sense you have brought something else to me." We can then just barely make out in the darkness the figure take from her robes the small box containing the stone as she says, "It may be nothing, my master, yet Aphra did take it from Palpatine's vault. It seems to just be a rock, yet I was unable to touch it." As soon as she finishes saying that, we watch as the box is taken hold of Vader by the Force, and he pulls it towards him. For a moment, we watch as it flies through the darkness. We then hear Vader say, "Perhaps I shall have more success with it, my apprentice." "Of course, my lord," the dark figure replies, as we watch the box open and the rock then float out of it. And within seconds, it begins to glow with a soft, yellowish gold light. And in that glow, we can just make out the face of Darth Vader, which, though it's difficult to tell, seems to be exposed other than some type of device over his mouth and nose. And of what we can see of his actual face, it looks paled and wrinkled, like ghostly dead flesh loosely hanging off bone. That's when there is a flash, similar to the one we saw when the dark figure touched the stone, only this time we can see that there is some type of small, almost holographic image being projected by the rock. And that image, much to the surprise of Vader, which we can see in his eyes, is what appears to be Anakin and Obi-Wan dueling on Mustafar, only we see Obi-Wan wielding a red lightsaber, and Anakin still his blue one. There is then another flash, much less intense this time, and the image of Obi-Wan and Anakin on Mustafar is replaced by an image of Anakin Skywalker, looking perhaps around the age of 50, standing outside what appears to be a Jedi temple, and standing next to him, wearing Jedi robes, is Leia Organa. Not far from them, we see a young boy practicing with a blue lightsaber. And Vader's eyes seem to fill with confusion as he looks upon this image or vision. But that confusion is quickly replaced by sorrow when there is yet another flash, and we see Anakin, maybe around the same age as we saw him in Revenge of the Sith, or just a bit older perhaps, sitting in a field of tall grass on a beautiful day, most likely on the world of Naboo, and at his side is Padme. We then hear Padme call out, "Luke, Luke, where are you?" And moments later, a boy, only a couple years old, comes crashing through the tall grass, and gets wrapped up in Padme's arms and lifted off the ground. While Luke just giggles, Padme then says to him, "Now we just need to find your sister." And that's when Padme begins to call out for Leia. And soon enough, she too comes stumbling through the tall grass, and it's Anakin who wraps her up in his arms and lifts her off her feet. And that's when we focus in on the face of Darth Vader, and see the shock and perhaps anger in his eyes. We then very quickly see a hand come out of the darkness and wrap around the rock and envelop it, cutting off the soft glow and bringing an end to the images and visions. The dark figure then hesitantly asks, "What is it, my master? What has it shown you?" Vader says back only one word, "Possibilities." The dark figure then says, I don't understand, it's just a rock." Vader says nothing to that, and instead commands, "Inform Grand Admiral Versio to prepare the fleet. The time for our return has come." And that is how this part ends. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you thought of this part of the story and what will happen next. So leave a comment below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.